Hey, what's up? Hope everyone's doing all right. So we are on week 45, and so we're just finishing up Acts 15 through Acts 28, and so it's finishing up the Acts, and I think the thing that like when I think about Acts the most, I think about Paul a lot in Acts, but there's a lot going on in Acts. There's like Peter, and then there's a lot, and I didn't really realize how much I liked Acts until I was actually reading it. And so a lot of times when I read the Bible, sometimes it seems kind of like work or like I'm like learning or I'm like, lifting weights. So there's like a lot of effort that's put into it. But when I was reading Acts, I actually was enjoying it. And I just think that it's really like I just see like a lot of my events today, like the things that are happening in my life. It's really, what's the word, relatable a lot about what's happening in my life right now. So reading Acts is really enjoying it. And so on Monday I have Paul persecutes the church. And so in the beginning, you have Paul, and he's like the main persecutor of the church. Not the main persecutor, but it talks about him being like one of the main persecutors of the church. And I think in one of the letters later it talks about how like he did a lot of evil things. He's talking about himself, like how he did a lot of evil things, but he said like he was kind of saved because of his ignorance, because he did it ignorance. And so he not knowing what he was doing, saved him, and it makes it so he was, not as condemned or is not as punishable. But he definitely has to go through a lot. Like he has to do a lot of different things, and he has to go through a lot. And he goes through, I don't know if he has to, but he goes through a lot of persecution. He gets beaten like 39 or 40 stripes minus one, and he's stoned to like death, and somehow revives, and he just goes through a lot. And I wonder if that is because of his persecution of the church, that he has to be redeemed, even though he did it in ignorance. He still has to be redeemed. And so he persecutes the church a lot, and he comes in with Stephen's death. I don't know what role he plays in that, but he said like he gave his coat or something. I don't know exactly the phrase it is, but he seemed to be okay with them killing Stephen. And so he persecutes the church a lot in the beginning, and then later on he becomes like one of the main supporters of the church. So obviously, when you have somebody who's persecuting the church and then he becomes like the main supporter of the church, then you have a lot of eyebrows that are raised, and so it's a lot of power given to this. And just a trip, man. Like when you read the Bible, like when I read it now, like it just doesn't seem, or like when I used to read it, or when it was read to me in churches, it just didn't seem to have the same amount of power that it really does have, the same amount of power it has now. And maybe because it wasn't written in truth, or wasn't read in truth, not written, but read in truth. And so because it's not read in truth, and the people that read it, they're not really like giving the amount of power that's actually deserved to for the Bible. But now when I read it, it just has a different vibe to it. And I think too, like before, like I didn't necessarily believe everything that was written in there, but now um, I believe it all pretty much, and I try to believe all of it. I mean, it's real. And so before, like it just I had to like convince myself it was real. And now I don't really think I have to convince myself that it's real. At least not so much. It seems to be just kind of my life and things that I've seen. It just seems to be pretty obvious that it's real before I like had to convince myself. And so it just has a lot more power. And so for Tuesday, I have Paul sees Jesus, and so he gives the account of when he sees Jesus like three different times, or the Bible gives the account. He gives the account to King Agrippa, and then the Bible gives the account when he sees him, and he also gives the account to the people when they're like persecuting him or following him out of the synagogue, and then he speaks in the Jewish tongue to him. But this account where he sees Jesus is told in three different times of the Bible, and it's like a little bit different each time. The vision that he gets, and of course, if this happens, like it's just hard to imagine how difficult this would be. And he goes blind, and like going blind when you're when you have guilt in your heart because you did something wrong, and then going blind, how terrifying that would be, not only for your life but your soul for the rest of your existence. How horrible that would be, and then to be relieved of that, and the relief of that would just be so amazing. And I guess the going through pain is really difficult, but the relief of the pain become like an addiction. And so it's just an important thing to kind of think about, into the relief. He's like, okay, well, now I got to go through all this stuff, but a chance of redeeming myself instead of being, completely condemned. So that relief in the miracle of him, getting his eyesight back, I imagine it was very powerful. And the amount of power and the amount of gratefulness and stuff he would need in order to finish the work that he has to do. And so Wednesday I have Paul spreads the gospel. And so Paul spreads the gospel, at first I think he goes to the Jews and then to the Gentiles. But initially I think he goes to the Jews. And there's an interesting thing where he goes and he circumcises a guy. And it's because the guy's, I think his mom was a Greek and his dad was a Jew, or his mom was a Jew and his dad was a Greek. I forget which one it was. But he goes and he has a guy circumcised. At least that's what it says. And so there's just like this argument between, if you are Jewish, do you still have to follow the old law? But the Greeks and the Gentiles don't have to, but do the Jews. And later in his writings, maybe this is just like an evolution of his theories and theology. But in his writings later, definitely it seems like, he says if you were uncircumcised, then you don't need to be circumcised, and if you are circumcised, you don't need to be uncircumcised. Like whatever you're called at, that seems to be what you should be. But in his letters, he expressly talks about how, you don't have to follow the law anymore, and if you want to follow one piece of it, you have to follow all of it. And I think the letters are pretty obvious, saying that we're not under the commandment of the law, but it definitely seems to be in the beginning this is something that they had to agree upon, and maybe this was just something that it was important for them to come together. And if there was not everything was easy, then they might have division. But since this was a difficult situation, then everyone had to come together and then share the responsibility of the actions, instead of it being really easy and then everyone kind of just forming their own part of things. But they really had to come together, because I don't think one of them wanted to have the responsibility of being wrong. So they all had this responsibility and they're all in it together, and they had to come together and they had to get along into understanding it's being right is great, but you don't want to be wrong and then have the consequences and the responsibility and the condemnation of being wrong. So I think this is a way for them or a way for God to bring everyone together when you have these difficult things you had to solve, and one of this was the circumcision and following the law. And so you have the original people of the church really having to come together, like I said, and come to a conclusion. I think there's a lot of positive thing that comes about this. And then so Thursday I have Paul is persecuted, and so Paul becomes a persecutor, and the persecuted, when he was the persecutor, he becomes the persecuted, and he's persecuted quite a lot. And it's interesting how much he was persecuted, how much he was hunted and condemned. And I think that we read about it, we kind of know the ending, but I think that just being persecuted and these mobs coming together and trying to kill him, being stoned or just being really just completely, how terrifying that would be to be completely under the power of a mob and what a mob can do, and how much they can hurt a person, and what they can do, and how the reasoning to being able to reason with the mob is very difficult. Being able to reason with an adult is very difficult, but to be able to reason with a mob is just a really difficult thing to do. And so without having the ability to reason and then not knowing what's going to happen, this is a terrifying thing that Paul seemed to had to go through in a lot of different places that he went to. And so he's just really persecuted. And not only when he gets there is he persecuted, when he leaves they still follow him and to persecute him wherever he goes to. And so you have this persecution of Paul that is very difficult for anybody to go through. And it's just something to reflect on, and just to understand where this comes from. I think a lot of that comes from okay, yeah, Paul wrote these rules. It's okay, well, I want to be important too. I want to write rules that God wants to do, or not really. He didn't really necessarily wrote rules, but he interpreted what Christ wanted him to do. And it's well, I want to be this thing. I want to have the same amount of power that Paul had, but I personally wouldn't want to go through all the things that Paul had to go through in order to get this, or that he went through. And so I just want to make I know that I'm not Paul. I don't want to be Paul. I don't want to have to go through those things. And I think that if anybody that really understands pain and tribulation and these sort of negative things that can happen, then I don't think anybody really would want to be Paul, because pain is just so overwhelming. And it's not only the pain, it's just the hopelessness and the not knowing if you're right or you're correct, because we're all sinners down here. So where are we really in our innocence and our standing between God and to know what that is and to question that is just super difficult. I don't think anybody really want to go through that. And then Friday I have Paul writes letters. So I think Paul writes the most letters in the New Testament, like Romans, Corinthians, Ephesians. I think that he writes in the New Testament. I'm pretty sure he's like overwhelmingly writes the most letters. And so he writes a lot of letters to the early churches and gives a lot of instruction and a lot of interpretation of what Christ wants. And, I think that his letters are super influential. And if you read Acts and you kind of understand the things that he went through, that it makes, his letters can really give context of like everything. But if you don't read the Bible all the way through from the beginning to the end, you just read the letters and you don't have the context of what Paul is, not only just what Paul is, but just the other prophets and stuff that are before Paul and the other people of the Bible, the main characters of the Bible, or just all the characters in the Bible, then it's hard to understand the context exactly what these letters mean. But if you read the Bible cover to cover, then I think it helps to understand the context of what these letters are and what they mean and the change of the what God wants from man. And so, but the letters are very, very powerful and they give a lot of instruction. I said, in order to fully understand the instructions, I think that you have a relationship with Christ and with truth. And for me, at least, like I feel like it's important for me to understand the Bible and to read it through. And so that's what I've been doing. And so now we're getting to the letters, and that's getting towards the end of the Bible. And so we're making a lot of progress. And so this is week 45. So after this is just week 46, 47, 48, 49, and 50. So just 5 more weeks to go. And so, I wonder if next year I think I'll still try to do this and still try to make the videos. And I feel like there's a lot of growth that comes along with reading the Bible and reading this amount of times. And then for me, at least, to do a video to reflect on it. I think there's a lot of growth that's involved. And so it's also an accomplishment, something that you start and you follow through to the very end. And, it might be one of those important things that I've ever done. And so, but at any rate, I hope everyone's doing good. God bless and happy truth seeking.